Wow. When you see the AP leading with a blast being compared to the 2020 Beirut port explosion, well, things are getting serious. This really does feel like a turning point in this whole conflict.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And it's not just the size of the blast, it's what it represents. This attack on Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut, maybe even trying to take out Nasrallah himself, that's a real escalation from Israel.
It feels different this time, doesn't it? So, for those of us who are still trying to understand why this is all happening right now, can you give us a little background on Israel and Hezbollah? What's the history here? Why are things so tense?
Well, the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah is not new at all. Hezbollah's been a serious problem for Israel for decades now. They're backed by Iran, have a lot of power in Lebanon, and have always opposed Israel's existence. There have been multiple wars, countless smaller conflicts, all driven by ideology, territory disputes, and just this deep mistrust.
And we can't forget about the recent Hamas-Israel war and how that's made things worse. Hezbollah swore they'd back Palestine, and it looks like they're following through with that promise.
Absolutely. That was a real turning point. It put Israel on notice that a conflict with Hamas wouldn't stay limited to just Gaza. Hezbollah was ready to open up a second front, which significantly raises the stakes for Israel.
And they're not just sending a few rockets over the border either. This Beirut blast, 6 apartment buildings completely destroyed, casualties reported, rescue workers desperately trying to find survivors. It's just awful.
It really is. And beyond the human cost, which is always the most tragic part, the choice of weapons is really significant. Israel deliberately used bunker-busting bombs, which are made to go deep underground before exploding. They're meant to destroy fortified structures,
Right.
and it sends a very clear message.
So it's more than just a tactical decision then. I mean, if they wanted to avoid civilian casualties, this seems like a strange way to go about it.
Exactly. This wasn't just about taking down a building. This was about showing their power. Using bunker busters in a heavily populated area, especially without warning the U.S. beforehand, suggests a much more aggressive stance from Israel. They're showing everyone what they're capable of and that they're not afraid to use it, even if it strains their diplomatic relationships.
So we've talked about how Israel is handling this, but what about Hezbollah? The AP article mentioned they were slow to react after the Beirut attack, which seems a little odd considering what they said before.
It is interesting, isn't it? You'd expect them to hit back right away, but Hezbollah are known for being pretty strategic. This delay might mean they're figuring out what they've got left and planning something bigger. Plus, they're operating within civilian areas in Lebanon, and that definitely makes things more complicated.
Yeah, very different from Hamas, who've been firing rockets almost as soon as Israel makes a move.
Exactly. Hamas has to be much more reactive. Hezbollah, on the other hand, they've had time. They've built up their infrastructure, they've trained their fighters, and they've even got some international support. Their level of organization and reach is just on another level compared to Hamas, which makes their next move very unpredictable
Yeah.
and potentially much riskier.
And their response when it did come, hitting Safed, well, we all expected it, but it's still worrying. The article talked about civilian casualties there, which just goes to show how quickly this conflict can hurt innocent people.
It's true, and it always comes back to that, doesn't it? The human cost of war, you can't ignore it. Both sides say they only want to hit military targets, but the lines get blurred very quickly.
Yeah.
Safed, this ancient city, it's caught in the middle of a conflict that's grown way beyond anyone's control.
And through all of this, Hezbollah is still standing their ground. They're still saying they'll support Palestine, almost goading Israel to take things further. It's a very dangerous game they're playing.
It is a gamble, that's for sure. Hezbollah wants to look strong, determined, but they also have to think about what might happen if they push too far. A full-scale war with Israel would be devastating for Lebanon, and while they've proven themselves to be a capable fighting force, they're not unbeatable.
Which brings us to the ceasefire that's being talked about. The article mentioned a 21-day truce that the U.S. helped put together, but it doesn't sound like Hezbollah is jumping at the opportunity.
No, not yet anyway. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Will Hezbollah pull back, or are they ready to fight a longer war, whatever the consequences? There's so much to consider. Hezbollah's own internal politics, how much Iran is pushing them, whether they think Israel will back down. It's a very complex situation, and right now it's anyone's guess what happens next.
It feels like we're on the edge of something much bigger here. On one hand, we're talking about a potential all-out war, and that's terrifying considering what both sides are capable of. But then there's this possibility of a ceasefire, a chance for things to calm down. What do you think? Is a full-blown conflict unavoidable at this point?
That's the big question, isn't it? I don't think anybody can say for sure what's going to happen. The AP article made an interesting point comparing this to what's happening in Gaza.
Hmm?
They suggested that this conflict with Hezbollah could be over quicker, but it's more complicated.
More complicated. It's already pretty complicated, isn't it?
Well, think of it this way. Hamas is stuck in Gaza, a relatively small and densely packed area. Their tactics are awful, but at least they're predictable. Hezbollah, they operate across a much larger area. They've got sophisticated infrastructure, and they're deeply embedded in Lebanon. It's a whole different ballgame for Israel.
So even if the ceasefire does happen, it doesn't sound like things will just go back to normal overnight. What happens next? What should we be looking out for as this plays out?
This is going to have a lasting impact, no doubt about it. One thing to watch is the humanitarian situation. Things are already pretty terrible in Lebanon, and any more fighting will just make it worse. Also, we need to see how the international community reacts. Will they try to push for peace talks, or will this turn into a proxy war with bigger players choosing sides?
Not a very optimistic outlook. But as always, you've given us a lot to consider. Any final thoughts for our listeners, something for them to think about as they follow this story?
I think the most important thing to remember is that things aren't always black and white. We tend to look at these conflicts in very simple terms, but the reality is much more complicated. Hezbollah isn't this single entity acting without thinking. They've got internal divisions, limitations, and they're always weighing up the risks and rewards of their actions. If we want any chance at peace, we need to understand these complexities.
Great point to end on. And to our listeners, I'll leave you with this. This is far from over. As you read the news and analysis, remember to dig deeper. Don't just accept everything at face value and form your own informed opinions. Staying informed is more important now than ever before.